Um, this is the fourth documentary in this series. Yeah, sorry, it says documentary three, but it's actually four. Um, it's a brief history and potential futurology of neurodiversity and neurodivergence, starting from the Disability Rights Commission, uh, Neurodiversity and Autism Action Group definitions. You can see the visual thing on that in the previous video. Um, Now, uh, this was the only officially endorsed national or international human rights report uh, endorsed by any official national human rights body of a UN recognized state or organization or uh, regional organization, continental or otherwise, or other body recognized by them, in which the majority of the members of that body, namely the Neurodiversity and Autism Action Group, or NAAG, of the Disability Rights Commission of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, UKGBNI, were representatives of entirely user-run, user-led national, regional, and international organizations representative of all neurodiverse, aka what's known as neuroatypical or neurodivergent uh, organizations covering the entire range of neurodiversity, um, which is also, of course, known as neurodivergence or neuroatypicality. Now, this includes developmental, uh, acquired degenerative mental health space, and mixed forms of neurodiversity, um, as well as those representing all neurological impairments uh, and conditions, um, mental health service users and survivors, and the UK's largest regional and national user-led, run and controlled pan-disability organisations. Uh, the largest regional pan-disability organisation was the one covering and representing Greater London at that time. This also was represented and included. It also included the user-run, user-led National Dyspraxic and Autistic-led and Dyslexic and Attention Deficit Hyperactivity brackets, open brackets, led organisations, as well as representatives of brain injury survivors and those involved in that field. So, the definitions of neurodiversity, etc., were all contained in the DRC NAAG Majority Report, formerly titled The Truth is the Majority Plus One, passed on the last Friday of the Disability Rights Commission's DRC's existence in September 2007. So it's the very last, and I would argue the most important, act that it did. All of these documents can be found on postings to the Disability Rights Commission Neurodiversity and Autism Action Group, DRC NAAG Legacy Group Facebook group, which anyone is welcome to join. I put them up there. Follow-up actions and documents have also been posted to this group, especially concerning those undertaken with the initial support of the DRC's successor body, the Equality and Human Rights Commission, EHRC, including its Disability Committee, such as the Centre for Access to the Built Environment, CABE website. CABE is now merged into other things, and Online Accessibility Neurodiversity Group, and the British Standards Institution, brackets BSI. British Standard BS 8300 /6, which is the subgroup number 6, Neurodiversity, Cognitive Impairment and Access to the Built Environment Task Force, its Disability Expert Reference Groups, brackets DERG, and its successor, the Accessibility Working Group. This includes access standards, revision, official responses, emphasizing the need to resolve access needs, clashes on the basis of universal design principles. because you do have clashing access needs. For example, some people who are blind or legally blind or partially sighted, they like very high contrast minoritism, and whereas most of the population, including most neurodiverse people, need lower contrast, more of a middling thing, and grey is the universal design, the real universal design default background, generally speaking, or something similar to it. But we really don't find that used very much in practice. I'll go into that in part why that will be. The documents include not just the majority report, but all related documents, including the unanimously agreed Neurodiversity and Human Rights Report by Joe Todd of Key4 Learning, DRC NAAG member, which the majority report built upon and extended, but the unanimously approved section of the majority report, the standalone document within a document, the Disabled People's Charter of Essential Needs to be Met, and Disabled People's Charter for short, was also one of the documents produced. The majority report included within it both the simplest brief definition of neurodiversity, neurodivergence or neuroatypicality, and its essence, and more complex definitions covering its main subtypes. The simplest definition was proposed by me, Adrian Wyatt, and unanimously agreed by the DRC NAAG at one of its meetings. And this was an uneven profile, at least in part. It's really quite short. This is also sometimes called a jagged profile, even shorter. This technically includes all types of profile and divergence from the average, with the clear implication, however, that we are talking about the neurological profiles in the broadest sense, including differences in brain function and ability. The aim is to ensure that these differences are systematically catered for. There follows a slightly longer definition of what an uneven profile is. This is a divergence of 5% or more in any particular area from what would be expected from someone's overall average profile, up or down, defined in terms of neurology and or average ability. Those who have this jagged or uneven profile are divergent or atypical in these terms. If this is so in terms of neurology and or ability in any way, then they are neurodiverse, like a neurodivergent or neuroatypical or ND or NAT for short. Although one has to admit here that it's not just a neurological thing, but that's how the term has evolved. Right. Those who do not in any way have this type of divergence are typical, or if you like, average. This applies to all types of diversity, technically speaking. If they are typical or average in this sense, in terms of neurological and or ability profile, then they are defined as neurotypical, or NT for short. A further expanded definition then acknowledges the different types of neurodiversity, neurodivergence or neuroatypicality, from an etiological or causal point of view, dividing it into developmental, happening essentially from early in childhood, or at least sufficient early that the person has no memory of having been different, or in other words, of having had a previous self for which they feel loss, e.g. due to disease and or trauma and or injury, and for which they mourn for, and to which, naturally enough, they seek or have sought to recover to, and that's pretty much invariably the case in those instances. The second type of neurodiversity is defined here and more broadly as acquired. This is as a result of a brain injury in the broadest sense of the term, whether this is traumatic, as in an injury to the head, which affects the brain directly or indirectly, or whether through a stroke or an infection, a poisoning, or a disease, including a tumor. And that persists until the person is fully recovered, which may only be in a minority of cases. Once they're fully recovered, if that happens, they are no longer neurodivergent unless they are in some other way. A third type of neurodiversity defined is degenerative. This is through degenerative conditions such as MS, multiple sclerosis, dementias, and a host of other conditions, genetic or otherwise, which implies, and unless and until through some new treatment, the degeneration has not only been prevented altogether, or if they are pre-systematic, or permanently stopped or reversed, in layman's language, cured or prevented from developing, as the case may be. A fourth type of neurodiversity is mental, or in other words, mental health based, e.g., voice hearing conditions, as is typical, for example, of schizophrenia, and also things like bipolar disorder, etc. A fifth type of neurodiversity is metabolic based. The Sunderland test of gluten and casein processing, devised by Professor Paul Shattock as a chemistry academic at the University of Sunderland, has consistently shown that 80% of those assessed as having conditions, quote unquote, typically associated with developmental neurodiversity, such as autism, all types, through attention deficit, hyperactivity disorder, dyspraxia, dyscalculia, dyslexia, and other related conditions, process much more casein and gluten into opioids than the rest of the population, creating at worst extreme cravings and behavior similar to extreme opioid addiction from eating food and drinking drinks which have these. In some of the most extreme cases, this craving can lead to compulsive attempts to eat non-foods, such as carpets, to try to extract the gluten and casein, which can turn into pain-numbing opioids. Furthermore, the results of these tests have shown that the more severe these symptoms are, the more profound, quote unquote, or deep the assessment of someone's developmental neurodiversity is likely to be, with severe autism the most profound on the scale, ranging through to very mild dyslexia as the least, though the correlation is far from absolute. In a few instances, metabolic treatments, including changes of diet, e.g., to milk and gluten-free, can lead to someone getting rid of any symptoms and thus being completely neurotypical in function henceforth, unless of course there are other things operating that prevent that. Nevertheless, such people will have had lived experience of being ND and are entitled to identify as such and to have help combating any resultant discrimination which continues to result, as well as the lingering effects of their ND past. The same should be said for the small number of people whom tests suggest have grown out of, quote unquote, or recovered from any type of neurodiversity. This can happen in the developmental process, and that includes autism and ADHD, though generally not the more severe types. It must also be noted that this still leaves 20% or so people who receive assessments indicating that they have one or more of the subtypes of developmental neurodiversity who have normal casein and gluten processing, though this may not always have been the case, especially if they've grown out of childhood or babyhood intolerances, such as those implicated in conditions like dyslexia, sorry, it should read eczema. Even within this 20% who test negative on the Sunderland test, some will test positive in genetic tests for developmental neurodiversity conditions. But some, such as Adrian Wyatt, the author of this channel, and the majority report, test negative for both, but have had a brain injury and or infection at a young enough age to affect development permanently. In my own case, I had a skull fracture and consequent traumatic brain injury, TBI, including swelling of the temporal lobe at 1 month old. This included hospitalization for 3 days and emergency measures to cool my brain and reduce swelling and damage. Permanent and irremediable damage and symptoms consistent with typical developmental neurodiversity, but also brain injury, were noted in a report done at the age of 6, including perceptual and fine motor difficulties, as illustrated by the dysgraphic and dyspraxic handwriting and some of the crossings out in this presentation. This leads on nicely to the 6th and final type of neurodiversity, mixed neurodiversity, or in other words, neurodiversity which is any combination of the above, of which I am one example. It should be noted, therefore, that the majority report acts in conformity with the original creations and use of the term neurodiversity, which was found in the 1990s on the lists covering both autism and dyslexia. It therefore rejects attempts to twist it into being merely an alternative word for autism, especially as there are small numbers of autistics, their most commonly preferred self-description, who do not have an uneven profile in any way. It also rejects, in line with the original attempts to exclude those with acquired dyslexia, including having difficulty reading my dyspraxic writing here. Dyslexia acquired in adulthood, for example, as the result of a brain injury, and that is actually quite common. And it also excludes using neurodiversity as a cognate for autism, or even merely for high-functioning types of autism that has been a feature of far too many websites, especially in America. No other country has had anything like the DRC NAAG to debate these things in a fully accountable manner. The Disabled People's Charter of Essential Needs to be Met, or Disabled People's Charter for short, was signed off by the DRC Chair, Jane Campbell Surbiton, and DRC Chief Executive Officer, CEO, Bob Niven, after being unanimously agreed by the DRC NAAG. It expands Southampton Centre for Independent Living, SCILS, 12 needs of independent living to 21 plus, and is neurodivergent inclusive, with such rights as those to have one's style of communication accepted, disability courts, and highly developed advocacy rights, as well as the right to have one's spiritual life developed and supported, and to be able to exercise control over one's own individual environment. It integrates with and expands upon the role of the disabled people's movement as a whole. The DRC NAAG majority report, The Majority is the Truth Plus One, attacks the hierarchy of impairments, also known as disabilities, and especially the domination of those higher up its hierarchy, wheelchair users, the deaf, the blind, the partially sighted, and generally those with more obvious and or fashionable impairments. It talks of alternative abilities and foreshadows the proposals made by me, on the suggestion of Eileen Quinton and the Autistic Rights Movement, United Kingdom, ARM UK, Inter alia. They took it off me, I took it off Aileen, to demand duly noted in the 2012 review of the UK's National Equality Act, the amendment of that Act to include neurodiversity and thus neurodivergence and neurotypicality as an additional protected characteristic under that Equality Act, because the deficit model of disability and impairments does not include areas of superior functioning, e.g. Very commonly in long-term memory, which many if not most NDs have. Nor does it take into account processing differences, which are merely different. This has been accepted by many trade unions and now the Labour Party, which remains the official opposition amongst others. The subsequent work arising, especially around access, but also around habilitation and rehabilitation, has included reporting under such mechanisms as the UN Disability Convention. Subsequent complaints led by me and endorsed by various organisations about inaction and worse, discrimination and actual worsening of situations, including against the European Union (EU) as a whole and against its member states who had ratified the UN Disability Convention at the time. The monitoring report on the EU was done, which is all 28 except for Eire, the Irish Republic. The UK had not yet left, and the UN Disability Committee and other UN bodies themselves were lifted up to the UN Human Rights Committee by the UN Disability Secretariat on the 6th of February 2017 as being partially beyond their remit, where they await meaningful response. I somewhere have the emails on that. The average waiting time is 8 years and growing for complaints, including those such as these part of the reporting process. This means this has been increasingly acknowledged, an increasing breakdown of international law and order globally, which is accelerating but will eventually have to be reversed to avoid perishing prematurely. That's not too alarmist, I don't think. More prosaically, if there is an inadequate final response and no other solution has been found, then it may be necessary to add on an additional protocol on neurodiversity to the UN Disability Convention and get it ratified. Better still would be an additional neurodiversity convention, as disability can never fully or adequately cover neurodiversity. As one of the principal activists who helped to get the neurodiversity group of the DRC and its successor, the Neurodiversity and Autism Action Group, set up, Colin Ravel, as well as playing a particularly key role in the creation of the Disabled People's Charter, said to me once that in a discussion he had with someone else, whose name I do not recall, it might very well take a century to achieve full and effective rights and integration for neurodivergent people, aka NDs, so this may be a very long road. It is to be hoped that areas of superiority, such as a big picture thinking or the converse, exceptionally detailed thinking, which many NDs have, will help on the way, including the superior art some of them produce, especially dyslexics and actually some autistics. Stephen Hampshire is a classic example of that. In this respect, we also need to note that we are going through globally, as usual, a series of civilizational changes and challenges, some of which only pan out over the very long run. A German philosopher, writing in a book published in 1918, The Fall of the West, predicted that by 2100, the West, then the dominant civilization in the world, as it still is just about, though already showing some signs of decline and decay, would be replaced by reverting to what it previously was prior to the 1054 Great Schism, when it fell away from Orthodox Christianity, namely the Orthodox Christian civilization. The replacement as dominant will, it is surmised, likewise be global. That is the Orthodox Christian civilization that it will revert to. And this was quoted approvingly in Serbian Archimandrite Justin Popovich's The Orthodox Church and Ecumenism, see English translation by the Nazarico Press, Birmingham, England, of 2000 AD. It should be noted in this regard that the DRC NAAG majority report, the truth is the majority plus one. The majority is the truth plus one. That's written correctly, actually. It's the first and so far only official document, as far as is known, produced by the Kingdom of England or any of its successor polities, such as the UK, since Orthodox England was overthrown by the confirmation of the Norman conquest to the coronation of the Romanist papist heretic Guillaume le Bâtard, or William the Bastard, Duke of Normandy, as King of England, quote unquote, performed by the ineligible and apostatizing Archbishop of York, because the faithful, true Orthodox Christian Archbishop Stigand of Canterbury quite rightly refused to do so, for which Stigand of Canterbury was eventually illegitimately claimed to be deposed by a false robber council of Winchester in 1071. So it is in that spirit, the restoration of legitimacy from illegitimate oppression and the restoration of proper respect, that the DRC NAAG work and the subsequent work flowing from it needs to be looked at. You'll find all the documents uploaded as postings to the Disability Rights Commission, Neurodiversity and Autism Action Group, Legacy Group on Facebook. We're looking forward to your involvement there and elsewhere. Thank you very much.